No problem.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So welcome everybody. My name is Corrado Giulietti. I'm professor of economics here at the University of Southampton. And most importantly, I'm a member of the GLO community, having been co-research director for a few years and responsible for the cluster area of China. But most importantly, I'm very pleased today to chair these sessions where Shyamal Chowdhury is going to present a paper on economic preferences across generation. Let me just give a very short introduction about Shyamal, who is professor of economics at Sydney University. Shyamal works in the in an area at the sort of intersection between labor economics and development economics, and has made several contributions concerning, for example, technology adoption or internal migration, seasonal migration of migrants. I still remember speaking to him a few years back on his econometrical paper. I was impressed about his data work and experimental settings. More recently, Shyamal has started working on economics preferences, and now actually this sort of transfers across generation. And today is going exactly to talk about this. Shyamal, probably you have a little bit less time than planned, so I will suggest that you go on with your talk, and perhaps if there are really, sort of urgent questions, that these are put in the chat or someone from the room maybe, indicate that there is a question. Otherwise, I would suggest that maybe we leave all the question at the end. So floor is yours, Shyamal, and again, welcome to this EBES meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your nice word, Corrado, and nice to see you and all of you. And also, thanks a lot for the invitation. I guess you can hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you well.
Right. So how long shall I speak for?
I think the plan was to go for 45 minutes. I think we have a little bit less, so about 40 minutes would be okay. I think if everybody in the room agrees, yes.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, yes.
Okay, great. So thank you. I would not take too much time talking about. So again, thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to talk about economic preferences across generation. So what I'm going to talk is mostly based on a paper that just came out at JPE, and I have noted it here. This is a joint work with Matthias Sutter and Klaus Zimmermann. So what we have done in this work, so we try to look at economic preference across generation, and we think that this is really, really important, and we make some so at the end, I'm also going to talk about why this is important, what we have done, and where the literature should go in the near future. So as Corrado has said, if you have any question, please feel free to ask. Now, here's the outline. It's a pretty long outline, but I would be efficient as much as I can. Okay, so if you think about economic preference, like such as risk, time, social preference, so they're important, right? So I don't have to motivate you about their importance. So they influence important outcomes like educational outcomes, labor market outcomes, financial success, health status, and we know many of those preferences are largely shaped in childhood. So if they're shaped in childhood, then it is very likely that family would play an extremely important role, right? So that's where we actually look at. Now, if we look at the previous literature, so what they have done when they talked about the role of family, right? So typically, you would see that in the literature, they mean one person. Okay? So typically the mother. So her mother's economic preference is linked to her children's preferences. Okay? And often only in one domain, either in risk or in time preference or in social preferences. So as far as we know, no research has really focused on different domains of subjects and how they are related to each other. even more so, what we have done here, we were able to identify how different types of those preferences are linked within a family. Okay, so at the end, you'll see that I'm going to talk about that we can identify families by types, where different economic preferences are linked to each other. Okay, so if you really want to do that, so we need to look at not only the economic preference of a single member, let's say mother or father, and a single child. We need to look at the economic preference of both parents as well as their children. And that's what we actually do. Now, we also need to think about that other variables are important, like social and economic status of a family, so, or IQs. So as you will see, we try to look at all of them and give a comprehensive picture. So what we have done, we went to Bangladesh and collected a large data set, consists of 542 families, where we elicited their economic preferences. So 540 pairs of husbands and wife, and of their 907 children. Okay, so in most families we have 2 children of eligible age, means those we can actually conduct an experiment with, and they live together in the same family. Okay? So we measure 3 dimensions of economic preferences: time, risk, and social preference, and all of them are incentivized. So again, unlike many previous works where these are hypothetically elicited. So in our case, all of them are incentivized. Okay? So we examine each of them individually, how they're linked to each other, as well as within a family. Okay? So we, as I said, we also have a very rich set of additional controls, such as personality traits and socio-demographic background data. So based on this data set, we think that we can say a lot of what is happening. So what we look at. So what are our contributions? So we claim that we are the first one to study whether the economic preference of mothers and fathers are related to the same degree to their children preferences. So this is important for a country like Bangladesh, where parents do not spend same amount of time with their children. Typically, mothers should be spending much more time. Okay, so we are the one first to answer this relationship between parents' preference and how that is linked to their children's preferences. Okay? Secondly, as we will see, that it is not right always to think about the kind of relationship that we get in rich countries would prevail in poor countries. Given the fact that most of the people live in developing countries, it is also need to see how these intergenerational preferences behave in developing countries. So I will be one of the first study to do that in a developing country. Also, we look at how economic status determine economic preferences, so how they're mediated. So this is again important, and we think that we have made an important contribution there. Now, so what we have also established what we call a family clusters with respect to how a set of different economic preferences related to each other within a whole families. We also identify which background characteristics determine those clusters, which family belong to what kind of cluster. So in this way, we think that we give a 360-degree perspective on economic preference within families. Now, let's go to the data collection. So the data that we collected comes from 3 different waves. So we started in 2014 in 150 villages in Bangladesh. We started for a different project, and we also collected data on preferences. So for this paper, so we picked households. The most relevant households are the one who have at least 1 child of age between 6 and 16 years during the time of the survey. So those are the children who could answer questions like it needs to be at least 6 years old, and it's not above 16 years. So we had about 1,000 households that are coming from these 150 villages. And we ended up having 732 who would be able to manage both parents, serving both parents as well as their children. So again, in 2016, we collected data on their economic preferences, both children as well as their parents, as well as their cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So in total, we have then at the end, we had about 542 families with complete data set, where both father and mother and their children had all the data that we needed: economic preferences, cognitive skills, non-cognitive skills, as well as their socioeconomic background. Right. So here is how it looks like. So if we compare our data set with the rest of the country, the population of Bangladesh, they are very, very similar. So if you compare the rural areas, they're a bit older because they have children. But otherwise, if you look at the socioeconomic background, those families are very similar to the rural areas in Bangladesh. So I'll not go to the details because this is not very important for our purpose. So in terms of experimental measures, so we elicited in 2016, we elicited their time preferences, risk preference, and social preference, and the order was randomized. So as I said, all experiments were incentivized, but only one of the three experiments was randomly chosen for actual payment, which is very, very common. And incentives are scaled contingent on the participant's age. So let's start with the time preference. So we used a simple choice list approach where participants faced a trade-off between a sooner but smaller reward and a later but larger reward, which is again quite common. So the choice list we used were kept simple in order to make it easy for children to understand the choice options. Both for children and parents, we designed 3 sets of choices. The earliest payment was always the day after the experiment, and the later payment was either paid between 3 weeks and 1 year after the earlier payments. For the current analysis of time preference, we use the total number of patient choices, which is a simple count of how often the larger but later reward was chosen in all 6 for children or in all 18 choices for adults. So for the risk preference, we use a measure which was made popular by Vince Wagner in 1980. So he used it in a different rural setting in developing countries. It is quite popular, where participants had to choose 1 out of 6 gambles that yielded either a high or a low payoff with equal probability. So the low payoff was decreasing and the high payoff was increasing, as you can see. So, and for risk preference, we use the gamble number. So we had 6 gamble 1 to gamble 6. So, higher numbers are associated with higher willingness to take risk. So again, the amount was adjusted based on the age, but otherwise the probability and the distribution were similar. Now for social preferences, what we have done, we have used an experimental protocol implemented in Bauer et al., who had extended Fair et al. So each participant had to make 4 choices between 2 options each. Each option described an allocation of X units of reviewers to the decision maker and Y units to an anonymous recipient of same gender and of roughly same age. In each of 4 choices, an allocation XY was always the allocation 1, 1. Okay, so here 1 star for me and 1 star for the other child. And there was another allocation which was different, that varies. Alternative allocation was designed to classify different social preference types. So from the 4 choices, one can create 4 mutually exclusive social preference types. So altruistic, if subjects maximizes the recipient's payoff in all 4 choices, or egalitarian, if they always minimize the difference in payoffs for themselves and the recipient, spiteful, if they always minimize the recipient's payoffs, and selfish, if they maximize their own payoffs. Okay, so then we have measured also cognitive skills. Okay, so for that, we used a locally adapted version. So we worked with the local university, from Dhaka University, and they have a localized version for Wechsler intelligence scale for children as well as for adults. that gives us a measure of full-scale IQ, which we call FSIQ. So it's a standardized composite measure of different components. So that we are going to use for FSIQ. And for the measure of non-cognitive skills, we looked at both personality traits as well as locus of control. So we'll be controlling for big 5 personality traits as well as locus of control. Right. So this is what all about data. So now let's look at the analysis of single preference at individual level. So how it looks like. So we start by presenting a descriptive overview of the experimental choices, as you can see in table 4. So it shows the means and corresponding standard deviations of different measures of time, risk, and social preferences. So upper panel presents data for parents, first combining husbands and wives, and then separately. Okay, and the lower panel displays data for children against first combined and then separately for daughters and son. In the aggregate, husbands and wife have significantly different time preference and partly social preference, but no differences in risk preference. Daughters and sons, however, show no significant difference in any of our measures. Okay? So then we move to the correlation of single economic preferences. So table 5 examines correlations. So it presents correlation among spouses, so husband and wife, between siblings, column 2, and between parents and children. Okay? So as you can see, husbands and wives' preferences are significantly positively correlated most of the time. So this is kind of surprising, okay? Because in Bangladesh, so marriages are actually, in most cases, they are actually organized by the parents. So more than 90% of the cases, they would be organized. So husband and wife did not have chance to look at who likes what kind of thing, okay? So it was not straightforward for us to expect similar preference of husbands and wife in that setting, okay? So if you look at column 3 and 4 address the correlation between mothers and children, respectively fathers and children, again, we observe significant correlation almost in all cases. So by and large, coefficients are comparable in both columns, indicating that mothers and fathers' economic preference are related to their children preference to a similar degree. So again, this is quite noteworthy given the fact that mothers spend much more time with children than the fathers in that particular setting. Okay? Right, so I talked about that. Then look, so the question that we ask is assortativity of parents, of their preferences. So we wanted to look at how wife's preference or husband's preference depends on wife or husband. Okay? So we regress husband's economic preference and wife's preference and vice versa. Okay? So what you'll see that despite controlling for all kinds of things, let's say difference in spouse's age, schooling, number of children, per capita income, their cognitive skills, we still see quite a bit explanation power of one's preference on others. Okay, so so there is a positive and significant relationship of wife preference to her husband's preference. So is it due to the selection of similar partners, even in case of arranged marriage, or a result of post-marriage convergence, right? So post-marriage, so what we said that post-marriage convergence is most likely not a main factor, but rather that the families of bride and groom seem to look for a match that includes similarities in economic preferences. So in the matching process, something might happen, and that might actually result in this kind of convergence. So as I said, we started, so we looked at both husband and wife and husband, and we find very similar results. Okay? Now, then we move to the relationship between children and parents' preferences. So here, what we are going to do would be regressing children preference. So children preference on parents' preference. So all, again, so patient choices, risk, time, risk, and then social preferences, spiteful, egalitarian, altruism, and selfishness. So this is the association between children and each parent's preference. So if you look at, all the measures, all the preference measures of time, risk, and social preference of children are positively and significantly associated with at least one parent's preferences. So we are controlling for a host of factors. So you can look at children's gender, their age, their years of schooling, whether they're attending school or not, father's schooling, mother's schooling, their per capita income, their household size, their IQ, big five, as well as locus of control. Even after that, we do see a big deal of explanation power of parents' preferences. Okay. So in the appendix, we also show that the relation of parents and children preference remains practically the same if we drop all control variables and only regress children preference on parent preferences. Similarly, we also find that mother's preference remains significant if other parents' preferences were excluded from the regression, okay? Or if we exclude father's preference or mother's preference. So other parents' preference remains significant. Okay? Right. So I just talked about it. So this relationship to the child's preference is practically the same for mothers and fathers, right? With one exception. So if you look at the statistics at the bottom of the table. So it is not the case that the father have a stronger relation to daughters. We also looked at that, whether mother is influencing more their daughters and fathers to son with respect to their economic preference. We did not find any of that thing. Also, notice that the per capita income of household doesn't have any significant relationship with single economic preference of children. Okay? So which is again a quite new and different from the literature that was already there. Okay? Overall, our results show that socioeconomic status of parents is practically unrelated to the economic preference of children when you consider each preference separately. So that's important that we are talking about separate preferences. Okay. So then we look at what are the channels, okay? Why things look like how they look like, okay? So we try to explore different things. You remember that we have collected a great deal of data, right? So we also have data on parenting style, right? So we regress preferences on children preference on parent preference, and then we control for parenting style, okay? Negative parenting and positive parenting. We also look at the degree of assortativity of parents with respect to economic preference. That's a homogeneous in their preference versus heterogeneous in their preferences in terms of parents. We also look at influence of older siblings on younger siblings. We wanted to see if the preference is coming through older siblings or not, right? We also look at potential peer effects within a village, whether this is like, they have been influenced by the village as a whole, okay? Village average preference. So we do find some of that. Okay? However, we still see a strong relationship of parental economic preference to children economic preferences. Okay? So we do see that there is a relationship between younger siblings with older siblings, or between average village preference and the preference of children in that village. Okay? But we still see that parental preference survived. Note that we also conducted an econometric exercise where we discussed what our data might imply with respect to the genetic transmission of preferences. So this is in the main paper that has been published in the appendix of that paper. So there we show that our data are not consistent with the story of pure genetic transmission. Okay? Then we move to the next part. So identifying family clusters. Remember, we have all three kinds of preferences, and we wanted to see if we can classify families based on different cluster of preferences, different cluster of families. And we also wanted to see whether we can identify socioeconomic and demographic determinants of the assignment to a particular cluster. Okay? So, here, if you look at the correlation, we do see correlation. So there are some correlation across economic preferences, right? So within individuals, our measure of 3 different domains of economic preference are related in a consistent manner for husband, wives, and children. So if you notice, more patient individuals are typically more risk tolerant, and that both risk and type preference are also related to social preferences. Again, we also see spiteful subjects are less patient and less risk-taking. In other words, spiteful individuals are typically relatively impatient and risk-averse. Okay? So what we do, we use a Matway's clustering algorithm, which provides 2 as the optimal number of clusters, which implies classifying families into 2 types of families, concerning the pattern of how risk, time, and social preference of family members look like. So accordingly, each family is assigned to 1 of 2 clusters that differ with respect to economic preference within families. So if we put them in 2 different clusters, so the 2 clusters of group of families that we identify are markedly different. Okay? So 431 families are classified into cluster 1 and 111 families into cluster 2. So how are they different? So cluster 1 families are significantly more patient, more risk-taking, less often spiteful, and more often altruistic or selfish. Cluster 2 families are more impatient, more risk-averse, and in particular, more often spiteful. Okay. So, and if you look at them, how these components are distributed, you can see that they are actually, there are clusters, 2 distinct cluster one can see. Okay. So component 1 on the horizontal axis can be interpreted as a factor capturing spitefulness, risk, and time preference. And negative values represent more spiteful, risk-averse, and impatient families. So we see 1 cluster here, and we see another cluster of families here. Okay. Component 2 has no straightforward interpretation. So I'm talking about 1 cluster here and another cluster there. Right? Now, we also wanted to look at what are the determinants of families belonging to cluster 2 or cluster 1. Okay, so impatient, risk, and spitefulness. Remember the cluster 2. So we just conducted as a simple probability regression. Okay? So whether someone belongs to cluster 2 or not. So what we found that the per capita income is now significantly determining whether a family belongs to cluster 1 or cluster 2. Same goes to household size. So what we find that the richer households are more likely to be classified in cluster 1. That means with more patient, more risk tolerant, and less spiteful members. So which would be intuitive in many senses. However, one thing, if you notice that schooling of mother is negatively related to belonging to cluster 1. So which is, I'll come to that, which is a kind of surprising results, because one would expect that they would be belonging to, so more schooling of mothers would be belonging to cluster 1, right? Not to cluster 2. Okay? So I'll come to that. So that one of the differences we find. Okay? So this is the next thing, the differences between Bangladesh and rich countries. So our finding of a negative relation, so one thing that we found is that there is a negative relationship between IQ or schooling and patience in our data, okay? Both for children as well as for adults. So which was kind of surprising, okay? So in rich countries, a higher IQ goes hand in hand with higher patience in developed and rich economies, okay? Yet, what we find that, so, and that was accepted in the literature that this is how it is, right? But then we use the data from Global Preference Survey, and we classified countries into high income, middle income, and low income. So if you look at the relationship between patients and subjective math skills, which we would say IQ as a measure of IQ, so you see there is a strong positive correlation between patients and IQ, right? But that holds only in rich countries. In middle income countries, the relationship is flat, the green line. In poor countries, the relationship is actually negative. So our story that, so this negative relationship that we found in our data actually is much more. It's not a story of our data alone. So that might be true for most of the poorer countries, right? So that's one of the difference we find. Then again, the second thing we talked about this the spitefulness of mothers, right? And belonging to cluster 2. I mean that why high mothers with higher years of schooling are more spiteful, right? That's another finding. We could not find a result data on spitefulness, but again, we looked at the relationship between patients and years of schooling. Again, we see that mean years of schooling, we see a positive relationship. The relationship doesn't hold in middle-income countries, and definitely not in low-income countries. Okay? So this is, again, something that tells us that the relationship that we observe in rich countries, we should not really assume that that would be universal and would be applicable in other places too. Right, so let's look at the conclusion. I guess I'm almost on time, hopefully. Okay. So the formation of economic preference has become a very important subject, and it is supposed to be so, right? So it has become so prominent for 2 reasons. First, economic preference, like risk, social preference, have been found to be very important for subjects' success in life. And we also need to find out, so there is a new literature that's trying to understand how policy interventions in school or families can shape or influence the economic preference of children and adolescents, right? For both reasons, it is important to understand how economic preferences are formed. So we have found that the economic preference in all cases positively and significantly related to their children's economic preference. So both parents are important in the formation of children's economic preferences. It's not father or mother. So in the context of Bangladesh, our findings of equally strong relationship of mothers and fathers are also noteworthy because most mothers work at home. In our case, 90% of the cases, mothers are housewives and spend much more time with their children than fathers do. So also our joint analysis of all those together have found that 4 out of 5 families belong to a kind of cluster that would be a good cluster, which is risk tolerant, non-spiteful, and they're more patient. And the other cluster would be applying to 1 in 5 families. So again, so richer households are more likely to have more patient, more risk tolerant, and less spiteful members. So those belong to cluster 2 requires a different kind of economic policy, right? So that has quite significant policy relevant as well, right? So as I said, some of our results look very different from well-known patterns: negative relationship between IQ and patients, negative influence of mother's education. So it seems important for us to extend our knowledge of how economic preferences are formed and relate to each other in poor countries. So better knowledge may ultimately help us to identify children and families whose preferences are non-conducive, as I said, those who belong to cluster 2, and policy interventions to promote economic preference that leads to long-term success in life could be designed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shyamal, for this fascinating research and inspiring talk. I think I'm aware that there is another session upcoming at 12, but I was hoping, you know, to maybe get 1 or 2 questions if the public or if colleagues in the chat, you know, if you want to post a question, you can do it on the chat, or someone maybe can help me getting questions from the room. The mic seems closed on the room, so I might not hear.
I wonder whether I can ask a question.
Go, please, Francesco, go.
Yes, according to your data, the people you investigated are working in the agriculture sector, most of them. Don't you think that this may affect in a heavy way your results, and then the possibility to extend them, and as a result, you can spend for policy advices for the country as a whole. I suspect, for instance, that the role of education, given the low level of education of people involved, may be a variable which creates some noise in your analysis.
Yeah, thanks. So what you're asking is basically the external validity of our results. Right. So that's quite, I mean, that's quite true for many results, I would say. But so what we try to look at is that whether the population that we have worked with, whether they are representative of the country, rural areas. So they are quite representative. So our results would be applicable to the rural setting in Bangladesh. We don't know if they would be applicable in urban setting. However, some of the results that we have found, for instance, impact of, so the relationship between IQ and patients, for example, right? So we also see that they might actually hold even in other developing countries, okay? Of course, we need to do more work of similar kind in urban areas and also in other developing countries before we can say something, before we can generalize. But at least the results that we usually accepted in rich countries should not be applied to poor countries straight. That is something I think is also important. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Shyamal. Are there other questions? If not, I think we are spot on time, and I would like to thank again Shyamal for his talk and this time. I would like, yes, to thank the EBES organization, and I wish all participants a good continuation of the conference. Thank you.